To the Common Good podcast. Around here on Fridays, we like to talk about science, as you might know, part of a regular weekly routine. And today we're going to be talking about how to help those who are reluctant to get the COVID-19 vaccine to consider getting it, especially those who come from religious backgrounds where their religion might be part of their narrative for not getting the vaccine. Which, if you don't know, that's a thing. And if you don't know, it's rather confusing to a lot of us. So I'm Doug Pagitt here in Minneapolis, and joined today by our regular, one of our regular co-hosts on Friday, the astrophysicist, Paul Wallace, in Decatur. Hey, Paul.
Hey.
And we're so glad to have a medical doctor here. Erin Wise is with us. Erin, it's good to have you along, because what we have heard over and over is, believe the scientists, trust the scientists. But all the polling says people don't always trust the scientists. But you know who they do trust? Their doctors. So we need you, Erin. And I know you and I had a conversation last week about what is going on with people of religious backgrounds, especially those evangelicals, a tradition that the three of us are familiar with and are engaged in. What is it with those of us who don't know, who are not taking this vaccine? So we'll open up the chat, of course, for people who want to be chatting along with us. So if you're watching live, let us know where you're coming from and let us know what you're thinking about this crucially important topic, too. All right, Erin, so let's set it up a little bit. You're a doctor. Do people believe you when you tell them to get the vaccine? And what's keeping them from getting it?
I suppose it depends on who I'm talking to, but there are certainly people that do. I mean, I work in the hospital, so all the work that I do is pretty much with people that are sick. Not everybody has COVID, but some of them have COVID. So routinely now we're asking people if they've had the vaccine and how long it's been since they've had the vaccine. And it's interesting to get their response. And I've had some patients recently who they just wanted me to tell them it's safe. It works amazingly well. Get the vaccine, and they're like, okay, I'll do it. And I've had other people say, I'm not getting that vaccine. That with that, there's not going to be anything I say that changes their mind. So, they don't always listen to their doctor, but we still try.
So, I mean, I have lots of people say that to me in my own life too. They say I'm not going to get the vaccine, and it's a myriad of reasons that none of which seem like they're like, it seems like it's people who don't care about not getting the vaccine, right? Like when I try to push and say, how come you won't get it? I can tell I care a whole lot more about this answer than they do, right? It's like not an issue of do they know or do they not know. It's an issue of do they care or not care. And it feels like there's just a lot of people who are like, they've set it aside. They're either going to get the vaccine or they're not. And if they're not, they're really not interested in justifying why they're not going to. Erin or Paul, is that true for either of you? Do you sense that same thing from people?
I confess that I haven't had that conversation. Certain people in my family who are very close to me are not getting it, and I have avoided that conversation. And I'm not quite sure what to do about that. So I don't have a whole lot of experience to share here, but I can tell you that that's a conversation that I'm very reluctant to have. I haven't decided that I'm not going to do it, but I also haven't decided that I am.
Huh. So you know that they're not going to get the vaccine. Like they say something that comes up, and then you just sort of
this person is not, and
bite your lip
because he is not, his children are not, because he's not.
Huh.
And they're of age, they're basically young adult children, college age, and maybe a little bit older.
Yeah. I have a very similar experience.
Yeah. Talk about that, Erin.
Sorry about that. I have a very similar experience. I would say probably the majority of my family are either reluctant or not willing to get the vaccine. And to some extent, I've engaged in that conversation with them. And you would think, they've been with me through my journey of becoming a doctor. I've been doing this for years. I mean, how much time did I spend going to school and doing residency? And I've been doing this job now for at least 13 years. And that's still not enough to convince them that I know what I'm talking about. So that's a little bit tricky, because even when you do engage in it, it doesn't necessarily mean it's going to change their behavior. So that, Paul, I agree. Some people I have engaged, and some I've also been reluctant, because I don't really know what the response is going to be. And I probably take it a little too personally when it's my family rather than my patients, you know?
Right. And that's my trouble. So I'm going to take it too personally and say something that I shouldn't say. That's what I'm afraid of.
One of the people in the chat has written that he believes that there's a religious narrative for a lot of people about the end of the world, and that there's going to be this rise of an antichrist, and there's some kind of a mark of the beast, and that this vaccine is a part of this big spiritual plot to try to, embed some kind of a tracking device that's going to have to do with a rapture narrative. I'm trying to speak as respectfully as I can about that, because I don't hold a very high view of that, and I tend to think nobody really thinks that. Like
that's what I think too.
Right? It can't be. But then I wonder, maybe it's 2%. You know, if you think of the 30% of people who are saying, I'm just not getting this, maybe of that 30%, maybe, I don't know, it's 3 or 5% that believe in some kind of a larger conspiracy, spirituality story that's in there. Erin, do you ever hear anything about that? Is that
I
a
have.
thing?
I mean, I've heard that from family members. I don't know that they truly believe it, but I have heard it. I'm like, wow, okay. I mean, the potential, I cannot even imagine the actual, like, how that it could even be possible. Like, the scientific community, multiple different companies, multiple different organizations have to be involved. All these doctors, you know, many of which who aren't religious, you know, like it's not even possible that we could do this coup and, like, you know, take over the world in this way. But I don't get the sense that that's the real issue.
Yeah.
I mean, I've heard from people, the common themes I've heard are, why do I need to get this vaccine? Only 1% of people are dying, which is not really true, but that's a common one that I've heard. I've heard from young people saying, you know, well, I'm not going to get sick from this, so why do I need to get this vaccine?
Yep.
I've heard people say they're worried about the long-term consequences from the vaccine itself. In particular, because it's been talked about as a new vaccine technology, when in reality, it's not really new. It's been studied for now 20 years or more. So it's been in the process for a long time. Those are the kinds of things I'm hearing. I think there's just a lack of understanding about the real risk and benefits that we're seeing, and the real cost of the disease. So I think the hard part is there's a media piece to this. There's a narrative that has happened over the course of the entire year that has downplayed the significance of the virus itself, that's downplayed the significance of the death rates, the cases, the testing, all this stuff that has happened for such a long period of time, where there's a chunk of the population, in particular those who are hesitant, who, you know, they don't even believe it's a thing. Before we even had the vaccine, I had a patient in the hospital whose parents were like, we don't think the testing is real. We're not going to let our kid get tested for this because we don't even think the testing is real. So even if they tested positive, we won't believe it. There's this longer narrative that it's not really that big of a deal. And so I think that just plays into that narrative that, do we really need this vaccine, when people are just, it's all hype, right? It's all hype. Right. This disease is not a big deal. It's just the flu. It's just the flu. You know, that's what's been said over and over to me.
Yeah, that's really interesting. That is what I've heard too. Someone said to me the other day, we've sort of had this running chat about getting the vaccine, and he and his family have said from the beginning that they weren't going to get the vaccine. Like back when last spring, when the conversation was, hey, the only way probably to get to have restrictions lifted, social distancing and face covering restrictions, is to get to the vaccine. And they were like, no, we're not. But they don't like the notion of vaccines generally, right? So they're kind of in the non-vax world. Not so much in the conspiracy, not so much believing there's a cover-up and conspiracy, but just they think there's a more natural way to deal with the stuff that we give vaccines for, right? So they come from that crowd. And he said basically what you raised. He said, how many 38-year-olds die of this? Like, I'm really not worried. It just, there's just no, to his mind, there's no reason at all to go and get this vaccine. Either of you, how do you think about that? Because the science people, the doctors, the public health, the politicians, they're all saying there's this like collective good that goes into it. But what do you say to somebody who's just like, I'm seriously not at risk of this. I am, this is like a medical advice that all the other medical advice I don't take, right? Like, sure, there's a whole number of things I could be doing. Right. Why am I going to do this one that's just totally outside my wheelhouse?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a really good question. For the average 38-year-old, are they going to die from COVID? Probably not. So like the case fatality rate in the United States, less than 1% of everybody under the age of 30 have died. Like the total cases of death are so low for those in this young age group. But it's still happening. There's still plenty of people that have been young and healthy that have died from this. But I also think we're forgetting, if the conversation is, well, I'm not going to die from this, then we're forgetting about morbidity. So, dying is mortality, but morbidity is when a disease has long-term consequences for you. And we all can recognize that. Let's say you have a stroke. You might not die from your stroke, but you may never be able to talk again in your life. That's a significant morbidity piece there, right? That alters your life. You cannot have your normal activities of daily living. You cannot do your job. You cannot function. That's a big deal, right? So if all we talk about is death and we need to, stop the death, then you're really actually not looking at the whole picture. Yes, the death burden here has actually been really high. We're at like 580,000 deaths thus far. Yeah, that's a lot of people that have died. I just heard the statistic that we have now like 35,000 kids, 17 and younger, who have lost a parent because of this disease. I mean, the death is a significant burden, right? That's not small. But then you look at the morbidity. So we know that there's, we've heard talk about this long haulers or long COVID. Yeah. So far we don't really know how many people have long-term symptoms because of this, but some of the studies are saying, patients that leave the hospital are still having symptoms 30 days, 60 days, even longer outside the hospital. They haven't returned to their normal activities of daily living. So, you're sick enough to be in the hospital, there's a chance that you never return to normal, period. So, and, they're reflecting that this has altered their quality of life. But then there's those people who have mild disease that are also getting long COVID, that are getting these long symptoms, that are suffering from significant fatigue and some brain fog, sort of confusion issues, and dyspnea or shortness of breath, where they just aren't functioning as well as normal. And we don't know how long that's going to last. Are they going to have symptoms for the rest of their life? They might. Maybe they never return to normal. We don't know that yet. So if you really only look at death, that's one thing, but your average 38-year-old that's healthy, they get sick from COVID. Do you really want to be unfunctional during the day because you're so fatigued? I had I think he was probably 50, 60-year-old guy the other day that told me, oh yeah, I had COVID, and man, I never took naps before, and I can't function without taking a nap. And it's like 2 months after. He wasn't even actually my patient. He was like the husband of a patient. He was like, I can't function. That piece is amazing when you think about not being able to do your normal activities and how much it's affecting people. That isn't necessarily a bigger part of the narrative. So we're not just trying to prevent death here. We're also trying to prevent the morbidity that goes along with this disease. And I think,
well, can I make a comment about that? That's interesting, because one of the arguments against getting the vaccine is we don't know what the long-term effects of this vaccine are going to be. Yeah, right. That's exactly what I was thinking. That's a strong, and you're suggesting, well, we also don't know what the long-term effects of this disease are going to be. And actually, we know more about that, and it's worse. It's the long-term effects are worse, at least up till now. I guess we're only 4 months into people having the vaccine, and we don't know what long-term effects there are. There.
We're like 6 months into vaccine, actually. If you think about the fact that Moderna and Pfizer had like 30,000 people apiece in their trials. So the vaccine experts will tell you significant side effects, you're going to see those within 2 months. So we're far outside of the 2-month range. That's what they're watching for, to see if you're going to have any like significant adverse reactions. So I think the likelihood we're going to have significant adverse reactions from the vaccine are nil. I mean, and how many millions of people have had the vaccine right now? If we had significant side effects, we know about it at this point. But I think the other interesting thing is, I mean, we have lots of viruses that cause long-term consequences. So hepatitis viruses, they cause liver cancer, right? HIV, you live with it for the rest of your life and causes all kinds of problems. Herpes, you know, you get your cold sore all the time, or you can get a brain infection because of your herpes. There are viruses that stay with you for life that you cannot get rid of. So it's just like, you know, I think it's a lack of good information if you really honestly think the risk of getting the vaccine is higher than the risk of getting the disease. That's why, you know, I had this amazing privilege to be one of the first people in the entire world to get the vaccine. And that's why I was
didn't know this. Hang on a minute. You buried the lead on this one.
I mean, well, because I'm a frontline provider, right? I've been taking care of COVID patients. You know, I've been in the hospital working this whole time, right? So frontline providers were some of the first people in the world to get the vaccine. So
my wife got it in January.
Up front and center. I got it in December and I was ecstatic. I mean, I won't pretend that I wasn't a little bit nervous about something that's new and nervous about the side effects, because we know that there's a fair number of people that get fever and feel like absolute crap after getting the vaccine. It's a thing. That does not mean that you got the disease. It just means that your immune system works. I actually have partners who were worried if they didn't have side effects, that maybe they didn't get enough response from the vaccine.
That's what I feel like. I had nothing at all. And I'm like, see, I got the placebo. They're still shooting a placebo into some of us, I bet. They're still running a big game. I'm kidding.
No, I didn't have any symptoms either, but I mean, I cannot actually complain, because the day that I got the vaccine, I worked the night shift. So if I had had symptoms, I probably would have been just absolutely 100% miserable. But I mean,
I had some symptoms. I certainly did for about 24 hours. I had fever and chills and aches and fatigue and nausea, and then it was gone.
Did it start just like a miracle? It just went away.
I woke up the next morning and I felt as good as new. Yeah.
What
you know, the fascinating thing to me is, we don't know this, and I don't think there's a good way to study this, but like, you know, for those people that had significant side effects and felt miserable, imagine if you had gotten the disease itself and that was your immune response. Because part of the problem with COVID is your immune system is overreacting, right? So you get the acute infection where you have the respiratory symptoms, but we're seeing people in the hospital with a secondary immune response. And so it's their immune system being super, you know, kind of overreacting to the virus itself. So let's say you didn't get the vaccine and you're the person that had a significant side effect from the vaccine. If you had gotten COVID instead, would you have been more likely to end up in the hospital? We don't know that. You know, you can't really test that, right? But it's fascinating to think about. Like, so Doug, maybe you and I wouldn't have gotten that sick. We would have had mild symptoms, you know, but Paul, you would have been in the hospital. So, you know.
Yeah.
Hey, so Erin, let me ask you this one, because I've been confused about this question. If someone's already contracted COVID, why do they need to get the vaccine?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. So there's variable amount of immune response that happens from the virus itself. And we know that if you get the vaccine, your immune response is significantly higher. So, you know, maybe you have a mild case of COVID. How is your immune response going to be? Are you going to have enough, you know, of an immune response that you're protected for 3 months or 6 months or a year? But if you get the vaccine, your antibodies, your body's protective measures are so much higher than the disease itself. So is going to last for longer. We still don't know how long the vaccine is going to last for. So we really don't know. Is this something that we're going to have to get a vaccine every year, every few years? I mean, there's several vaccines out there. Obviously, the flu vaccine we get every year, but that's because the flu changes enough every year that we have to get a different vaccine in order to cover the most current strain of flu that's out there. Whereas there's some other diseases out there like pertussis that you get a vaccine booster every so many years so that you can boost your immune response again, because it's waned over time. So we don't really know where we're going to end as far as whether or not this is something that, we're going to need more than one vaccine or a booster down the line as of yet. But we'll know more over the next year or two, probably.
So one of the questions that people raise about this is that they say things, when they're being more generous as opposed to sort of reactive, like, I'm just not going to get the vaccine. And people are telling these stories in the chat here. I'll pop some of them up here in a minute. But, their own older parents in their 80s that have other health issues that are still not getting the vaccine, even for themselves. So there's a lot of reasons people don't. But one of the things that we've wanted our scientific community to do is not to experiment on human beings, right? So we have this entire process for how a drug or a vaccine comes into public use. And in this one, we sort of all agreed to set that aside, and to, not study for the normal length of time before many people get it. Is it fair for people to say that this is essentially experimenting on hundreds of millions of people? Is that what would that be a fair characterization? That, say, would have been made 3 years ago about some other drug or vaccine about some other issue, and they just said, we just want to give it to everybody and kind of see what happens. Is that a way to describe? Is that a way to describe what's going on? Because I know that's one of the pushes that people make on this.
Yeah, I heard Francis Collins, who is a believer and also the director of the NIH, said, maybe it was probably not in our best interest to call this Operation Warp Speed, because it made people think that we were doing this at a ridiculously high pace. What's really interesting, and I am not a researcher, so I don't have to go through all this red tape. There is a ton of red tape, in particular with vaccines. I mean, like you mentioned before, there's a whole anti-vaccine movement that existed long before COVID. And there's the whole, this public health measure that you're going to give to millions of people. It has to be safe. If you're going to do it, it has to be safe. And so there's all this red tape, and there's all these different phases of trials that happen. So there's 3 different phases of trials that happen whenever you're developing a vaccine. And those trials happen independently. So you don't start, so you have phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, and they don't overlap. And so my understanding of how these trials work is that, you do your first phase, you have to get approval for your first phase. You do it, you do the research, you look at your numbers, what came of it. Is this something that's useful? Is it not useful? You go through the red tape measures, and then you plan for phase 2, and you have to have funding for phase 2. You have to have approvals for phase 2. You have to have all of these things in order to start phase 2. Then you do the phase 2 trials. You get your numbers from phase 2. You get your response to phase 2 trials. You do all of the paperwork and all of the things, and it looks like phase 2 is working. So then we have to prepare for phase 3. And phase 3 is the hardest, because phase 3, you have to recruit people to be part of the study, and it takes a lot of time, and it takes a lot of money to do that. And so all of these trials, each and every step takes a great deal of time to do. And then after you've gone through your research, then you have to do all the paperwork and all the things that go along with getting approval for the vaccine. So here, the warp speed wasn't cutting any corners. It was just overlapping those phases. So phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, they're happening in tandem instead of, they're happening all at the same time instead of one after the other. So, really, actually, these vaccines trials, it's actually safer than other vaccines. So it's the opposite of what you would think, because it's
why is it
faster.
safer? And
why
is
is
this
it
just going to
safer?
be? Yeah.
So it's larger trials of people that have done that, the phase 3 trials are larger, but then also the oversight. I mean, we've been putting this under a microscope in a way that we have never put it under the microscope before. And what's also really interesting, there's been this vaccine reporting system that you've probably heard about called VAERS. I think it's VAERS. It's a voluntary for people, but for the medical community, if you have a significant adverse reaction that you think might be related to a vaccine, it's a reporting system where you can, you fill out a form.
Yeah.
So you fill out this paperwork, whatever. With this, people have been really looking for any problems with the vaccine. So it's actually been promoted. If you have any problems, make sure you're filling out a VAERS form. They've actually also sought out people, especially early on when they were getting vaccine, you could self-monitor and self-report any symptoms through I think it was like a web-based tool or a cell phone-based tool. And if you had a significant enough side effect, they would actually track you down in order to fill out a VAERS report so that it went in the official system so that they would research it. So if you report something in VAERS, then it doesn't mean that it's because of the vaccine. It means it's going to be looked into, especially those things that are severe outcomes. So I think even recently, and I haven't actually watched the video on this, it sounds like the news is that Tucker Carlson is talking about the VAERS system, and there's misinformation related to the VAERS system.
Yeah, and he's saying that 30 people are dying a day because of the vaccine. He's saying this kind of nonsense. Yeah.
Which is, I mean, it's crazy because honestly, if that was happening, you would know about it. Look what happened with the Johnson & Johnson vaccine. We have these blood clots that, like at the time, it was 1 in a million blood clots. They shut it down in order to look to see what is it that's happening? How often is it happening? Is this safe? Is this not safe? I mean, it got shut down like that. If 30 people a day were dying, this vaccine would be shut down. So that's not even realistic because, I mean, really, the whole medical community wants to help people. I think it's nothing short of thinking that we have nefarious purposes if we're really out there trying to kill 30 people a day.
Well, I think that's I can't, if I buy a Christmas gift for my son in middle of December, I can't keep it secret from my 4 family members until Christmas. And in order to believe stuff like what Carlson is saying, you've got to believe, like you were saying earlier, there's no possible way to keep that under wraps. It's like the moonshot. 100,000 people worked on that, and they all kept it secret. It's all a hoax, and they all kept it secret. I just don't understand people who think like that. All right,
let me throw this statement from George Falco in here. George, he writes this. Sorry, it's a little hard to read. I should have changed the color. He says the science behind these gene-altered vaccines, I think he's speaking of Moderna and Pfizer, are crazy. He says they're genetically altering the virus, then injecting it into the body. It's not what's found in nature. Okay, so George goes on later in the next comment to say, look, I'm going to have to get the vaccine. I'm going to get the J&J because I have to fly commercial, but I really feel like I'm being coerced into it. So if I could read into George's comment here, I think what he's saying is J&J is a traditional vaccine. Pfizer and Moderna, those two are this new RNA style, and according to him, he believes that they've altered the virus and then injected the virus into people to see how they respond. Now, doctor, this is where you come in, because there are a lot of people who still believe that what a vaccine does is to inject a dead version of the virus into you, or some altered version of the virus into you, and that's what's going on. So I think George is not alone in this. I've heard this kind of thing from lots of people. What do you say to someone who has those concerns?
So it's actually not wrong to say that sometimes we have inactive virus as our mode of triggering the immune system. That's not true in this case. So anytime we're giving a vaccine, what we're trying to do is we're trying to present the foreign matter. We're trying to present the antigen from a infectious organism, like a virus or a bacteria, to the body in a way that won't cause disease, but will allow your body to recognize it as foreign and mount the immune response. What I think is actually super cool about the mRNA vaccine is it uses your body's own machinery to create. It's honestly fascinating. They've been doing work on this research for like 20 years. And I think it actually has a lot of potential for treatments. Like there's potential for cancer treatments in this type of mRNA medicine. It's not really medicine, but using mRNA technology, there's like so much potential for this. It's actually just super cool. So essentially your body recognizes antigens or some sort of abnormal protein and says, this is not normal. I need to mount an immune response. But the problem with our bodies is we have a first line of defense that we have to get through first in order to be able to get the body to recognize this this antigen in order to create a response. So with the mRNA, what happens is it gets into the system, and the mRNA, which is a messenger RNA, gets into the cell. And when it gets into the cell, it's just a message. So yes, it's technically genetic material, but it's genetic material that cannot in any way combine with your genetics. So it's RNA, not DNA. Your body has messenger RNA throughout it all the time. Messenger RNA is what your body uses to create proteins. So this message is being brought into the cell in order to use your body's machinery to create the protein. In this case, the spike protein. So we're using your body's machinery. The message goes in, tells it how to make it, and then you make the protein. It gets presented on the cell. So there's no virus involved. Your body's just making the protein, which is not a normal protein for your body. So your body recognizes that as foreign and mounts the immune response. The messenger RNA degrades. It has no way of connecting with your DNA. That's not even possible. So the idea that, oh, it's going to alter your genetics, it's not even possible at all. Instead, it's just doing something that's very normal for your body. It's very normal for your body to use messenger RNA to create proteins. In this case, we're just creating a protein that your body doesn't normally create, and then it goes away. But cool. It's honestly really fascinating and really cool.
So Erin, that is exquisite, well described. Why in the world are we 6 months into these vaccines and people are not describing it like this? Like, what is it in the industry of medicine and science and media where people will talk about mRNA and they'll use these phrases and they'll talk about the differences, and really hardly anyone takes the 1 minute and 38 seconds that you took to describe how it works? Like, why is there not a full-on animated description? Like, why are there not little 2-minute YouTube videos and social media videos and texting videos all over that share how this works? Because most of us don't really have any idea how our bodies work, let alone how a vaccine works, let alone how a vaccine works that triggers a protein spike that's different. Like, this feels like it's a big part of the communication struggle for the percentage who feel like, I don't know what's going on, and I have all these people I've never heard of in my life all of a sudden saying I have to do something that I've never done in my life. Like, I bet the Venn diagram of people who've never gotten the flu shot and are not going to get this COVID shot, I bet that's about 100%. Right? I mean, it's just, maybe there's an anecdote out there, but I just think there's a lot of people like, I don't get vaccines. I just don't, that's not a thing I do. And now I have to, and I don't really know how it works. And you're telling me that this one's new and doing something we've never done, and we're cheering ourselves on. And your description was just extraordinarily helpful. I will put that on a repeat, and we'll plug that around.
I found it helpful too. You should be a teacher.
Well, thanks. I get the opportunity to teach residents sometimes, but honestly, I probably practiced it enough trying to explain it to my kids, because my kids are super interested. But honestly, so if you look back on my Facebook page, at one point in time, I shared this cartoon description that some doctor's kid created that was essentially the same thing. That was like how the mRNA vaccines work. It's not that. It's complicated. I mean, I won't pretend that I actually know all of the science behind it, but you can boil it down to pretty easy to digest. I think people I don't know that they actually care to hear it, because I think there is some out there. I mean, there's people that are trying to spread as much good information as possible, right? But I think on some level, the amplified voice right now is maybe the misinformation. The amplified voice is the fear piece. And so, I mean, I think that's why this is great. Like, let's amplify that knowledge so that it's really actually amazing technology. It's super cool. It's science using the body to do what it does best. It's awesome.
So there's this big study out there. I heard a radio show, not a study. There was a big effort put out by the Republicans to try to get Republicans who said, I am a Republican, I voted for Trump, and I'm not getting the vaccine. There's concern that subset of people in America make up a significant part of the vaccine hesitancy. And so there's a pollster who has done a lot of work with messaging for Republicans, named Lutz. And This American Life did a story about these panels that he put together, like a focus group. and how the focus group went. And they brought in doctors and scientists and politicians and talked to this group of people, all who were saying, I'm not going to get the vaccine. And then at the end, something changed and they did. So it's on This American Life this last week, if that's a radio show that you listen to in the podcast. So it's really great. And there's a lot of analysis about what happened here. The argument, which I started with at the beginning, was people don't always trust scientists, and they certainly don't trust politicians. They do trust certain people in their life, and doctors are among that. So that might be what's going on. I actually think there's an additional thing going on, and it is if you can get someone talking reasonably about getting the vaccine, and you can keep that conversation going for 30, 40 minutes, they'll end up in a more likely place to really consider it than they were at the beginning. And I think this is just true of a lot of issues that are hard for people to get to wrap their heads around. For most of us, we make our decisions very quickly, and then we, for some reason, defend a decision that we made very quickly, much longer than we ought to. And I think one of the things that moves someone into deeper consideration of a behavior that they weren't willing to take previously is to spend some time sort of sitting with their own ideas around it. I just wonder if just giving people more chances to even think about how they think about it, right? This is sort of the philosopher's attitude to the COVID virus, right? Which is spend some time thinking about how you're thinking about it. And the best way to do that is, what do you think of that, Erin, or as a doctor? And what do you think about that, Paul, as a professor? This idea that, boy, we just need to give people prompts and spaces and places to consider.
I think it's true. I think it's hard to engage people in that kind of conversation. And one thing I think is important, and this sort of speaks to Erin's position, is that, for example, the evolution versus creation thing. Yeah. It makes a difference if I go teach people about evolution if I'm in a church doing it as their pastor, or as somebody who's a fellow, a Christian. That makes a big difference. And I think that trust piece is really important. I don't think you can have a 30 or 40 minute conversation with a complete stranger, and have either of you open up considerably. But I think that when you're identifiable as a friend and as somebody who has sympathies for that person, and maybe even knows that person well, I think you have a better chance of that. If it's a religious thing, I think Erin's in a good position because she's a fellow, believer.
Yeah, I still haven't quite figured out the religious piece of it. I mean, that piece is still just baffling to me because, and that's where I have a hard time. I mean, I can talk about the science piece of it, and I love talking about the science piece of it, actually. It's kind of fun to tell people and to have them start to wrap their head around what, why we think it's important, why it's not just about death, why it's about protecting people around you. But the why, it's a hard thing to try to move the needle on. What I think is interesting is I think there's a piece of this that is group thinking too. So I think you're right, Doug. I think that people they're just making a snap decision. I mean, I've certainly seen the memes and the Facebook comments that were like, well, we don't have a vaccine for the cold, and we don't have a vaccine for HIV yet. We have this vaccine for this COVID thing. We shouldn't, trust that, that it came out that fast. Yeah. We have this idea that it's something that's bad, that it's, so simplified, and obviously so, it's too simple. So I'm not going to take this thing. So that snap decision certainly is there. I do think that if you can have those meaningful conversations with people, you can move the needle. And if you're having those meaningful conversations and those people are willing to talk to their friends, it makes a difference. So for instance, my parents are fairly reluctant to get vaccinated. I have yet to convince them for a variety of reasons. But what I know from them is that if they did get vaccinated and they were willing to talk to people about it, that it would make a huge difference. My aunt, who is high risk, lives with my parents. And if she told them if they chose to get vaccinated, she would get vaccinated too. right? So their effort, their decision to do something different than their friends and their peer group would make a difference. Several of my aunts and uncles and cousins are not vaccinated. And again, if my parents would be the ones to say, you know what, I did this because, you know, I trust the science, or I don't trust the science, but I trust my daughter who's done the science, who's done the work on the science end of things. And so I'm going to get the vaccine because, you know, it's important, and I want to protect my family, and I want to protect those around me, as well as I want to protect myself. I think that helps. And I think there is a piece of it. Doug, you and I had this conversation when we talked about it last week. Like, how do you convince people? I mean, the evangelical community are people that want to help their community, right? They're protectors. Right. They are people that love their neighbors, right? That's what they do. Right. That's what they want to do. To me, this is the essence of loving your neighbor. You can get the vaccine for personal reasons. You can get the vaccine just because you want to protect yourself. But it's not really just about protecting yourself. Yeah. I mean, that's the other piece of the science that people aren't really wrapping their head around, this idea of herd immunity, this idea of protecting your neighbor. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, they're fantastic vaccines. So if you get vaccinated, your likelihood of dying or getting sick enough to be in the hospital is nil, which is amazing. They're really, really fantastic vaccines. But there's also people around us that can't get vaccinated. Right now, our kids can't get vaccinated, right? So hopefully that will change in the near future, but right now they can't. So we can't protect them. And while they're not getting as sick, we don't know about, you know, how many of them are going to have long haul symptoms or the long COVID. Right. And then there's this awful multi-system inflammatory syndrome that's affected kids in a way that, again, we don't know the long-term consequences for them. So we can't protect them yet with the vaccine. There are people who can't get vaccinated, not very many, but a few who can't get vaccinated for medical reasons. And then there's people that have autoimmune diseases or, you know, kidney transplants or, you know, significant medical problems that even if they're vaccinated aren't likely to be quite as protected with a vaccine because their immune system doesn't work as well. So it's really about providing a buffer for them. And then the other piece is really the evolution piece. The virus wants to survive as long and as well as it can. You know, so it's mutating, it's changing. We already know about variants. The reason we have so many variants is because there's so much virus out there. There's so much replication that's happening that we have enough replication of the virus that the variants are actually like, oh, a useful genetic change. And so, you know, the more virus that's out there, the more useful genetic change, useful for the virus, not for us, the more useful genetic change is out there. So again, it's this bigger community picture too, that isn't just about the individual. And I think, you know, some of it really is, well, nobody's going to force me to do it. And it's my personal choice. So since it's my personal choice, you can't tell me what to do. But I mean, evangelicals.
But you can encourage someone to do the right thing. And what you're saying, just to be clear, is that from what they now believe about the vaccine, which they were a little reluctant to say this in December, but now I hear this. If I've received the vaccine, my second dose 2 weeks ago. So they're saying that even if I contract the virus, the amount of that my body will respond to it and will dramatically reduce the amount of virus that I'm carrying, that I will then will not be spreading as much. So I would now become
that one's the trickier one.
Isn't that the reason that I would get the vaccine if I'm not worried about my own health, but I'm worried about yours, is to reduce the amount of the amount of virus that I carry? Is that the notion?
Yeah, I mean, it's that. It's also like, you know, if you're sick and you don't know about it, but also, you know, so you're not spreading disease to other people. But it's not so much the you spreading disease to other people piece. It's sort of how do you protect? So, you know, if you're vaccinated, there's a chance that you could still get sick, but you're going to get mildly sick. So you're going to have less of a viral load. You're going to be less able to emit those viruses to other people. You're less likely to have, you know, to be the super spreader, right? But also, let's say the virus is coming in and trying to attack your community. You're essentially creating a hedge of protection around those people that are not able to protect themselves. So the virus comes in and it meets the wall. It doesn't get you sick, or if you do get sick, you're minimally sick. And so it can't breach the barrier to your community versus if there's gaps in the wall because a chunk of the population isn't vaccinated, well, then those people are going to get sick and then they're going to bring it into the community, if that makes sense. So really the other problem that I see is there are these pockets of people. So you mentioned Republicans. It's like 30% of Republicans who are like hard no on getting a vaccine, and 30% of white evangelicals that are like, I'm not getting this vaccine.
Yeah.
That's entire churches, right? So
Right.
that concerns me. That could really cause a significant death, like a significant series of events in a church.
Well, it'll be interesting to see in the next years if that happens, right? If you end up with some shared thought around the vaccine and not getting it, and then if we start to see these outbreaks, because we should, right? Like this theory will be tested. Yeah. Is that true, Erin? Paul, is that right? We'll know in a year,
so
2 years.
We had a measles outbreak here in Minneapolis a couple years ago, and it hit the Somali population the hardest. Why did it hit the Somali population the hardest? Because their rates of MMR vaccine are the lowest. They don't have enough herd immunity in their community, and they live in community, right? So they live and they're around each other. Right. Measles is super easy to spread, and there's a variety of reasons for that. But we know with measles in particular, you have to have a pretty high rate of immunity within your community in order to protect it from causing a bigger outbreak. So the majority of people affected were the Somali population. So the potential for us to see pockets of infection, I think rural communities are another piece of the group that are going to potentially be affected. So, I mean, those are all my people. All of them are my people. The Republicans, the white evangelicals, the people that live in rural communities, they're all my people. So that certainly worries me. Certainly worries me.
Yep. All right. Well, thank you I just want to give a little testimony. Old George, thanks for being honest about this. I'll pop it up in here. He says, actually, Dr. Wise explained the new vaccine in a way that I feel much differently about it.
Yay!
George, that's good of you to share that. All of you have been in the chat. We really appreciate all of your comments. You've been very, very alive in today. Way more than we could put in. I tried to sort of watch them and see if we were addressing the issues as we went. Erin, thank you for being a part of our Common Good Science Day. We'd love to have you on anytime and give you a regular spot as Ask the Doctor. That'd be very fun.
That'd be
Paul,
awesome.
Paul, thank you, and keep your eye on the sky. Paul's not only an astrophysicist, but if you follow him on Twitter, you know he's a birder. So this guy will look at the short-term things in the sky and the things way out there in the sky.
All kinds of neck problems.
That's a good point. And all right, Erin, thank you, Paul, and to all of you, we will.
You're welcome.
Have a great weekend. Unless you have other plans, as they say, and we will see you.
This has been super fun.
Okay, thanks.